Thank you very much, Danielle. I wish to reiterate some thanks to the Knapp Family Foundation, the Institute for Advanced Study, Philosophy Department, Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature. I want to reiterate some warm thanks to Laura Lechner, my former student and friend, the outreach coordinator of the Center for Jewish Studies, who has done a superb job organizing, putting together this. So thank you, Laura. You can applaud. This symposium would have been impossible without my colleague, Rivelène Prel, without her persistence and her unique dedication to the success of the center in general and to this event in particular. Rivelène is the one who encouraged me to go ahead with this project. I should say the one who twisted my arm and pushed me when I was drowning in so many commitments and when I stepped into the chair position on short notice last January. She is the one who has monitored every step of this organization and who has ultimately made this event possible. So thank you, Rivelène. I am truly honored to welcome our Dean, Michal Kobialka, and I thank him warmly for having accepted our invitation. Last but not least, thank you to colleagues, friends, and participants who are coming from prestigious institutions to share 2 days of reflection with us on a topic dear to me and I hope to you. Thank you to Sarah Hammerschlag, our keynote speaker, whose work has been an inspiration for this symposium. Special thanks to colleagues from the University of Minnesota who have accepted to chair panels and to be respondents, especially in the busiest time of this semester. Figural Jews, Jewish identity in modern literature and philosophy. Then, a title inspired by Sarah Hammerschlag's book, The Figural Jew, Politics and Identity in Post-War French Thought, published by the University of Chicago in 2010. In way of an introduction, I will briefly sketch the personal and intellectual itinerary that drew my interest in this topic, and how I see the evolution of Jewish identity in modern literature and thought from my own perspective, that of a scholar in French studies and literary theory. Even though I do not share all of Sarah's analysis, I think that her work is the first to have retraced a history of the construction and the deconstruction of Jewish identity, especially in France, from 19th century so-called philo-Semitism to its recent developments in literary theory and philosophy. The following account should shed light on the reasons why Sarah Hammerschlag's book has been so resonant with my intellectual and even personal preoccupations. When I was a graduate student a long time ago already, I had the privilege of attending seminars and of being mentored by the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard. Lyotard had become well known after the publication of The Postmodern Condition in the late 1970s, a book in which he heralded the end of the grand narratives of emancipation, namely the Enlightenment, the narrative of modern science, and Marxism. He subsequently became a beacon of postmodern thought, at least in its French avatar. Postmodern thought, in Lyotard's understanding, was characterized by a rejection of totality and teleology, and by a celebration of the fragment and the micro-narratives, as well as by its critique of modern emancipation and subjectivity, to which Lyotard opposed notions such as infancy, the inarticulate, the incommensurable, the différent, and indeed the Jews, all names for him of resistance to an emancipation that would leave no remainder. In the aftermath of the so-called Heidegger affair, or Affaire Heidegger, and of the publication of Victor Farias' book in the mid-90s, Lyotard published his Heidegger and the Jews. In that book, he endeavored to show that Heidegger's deconstruction of metaphysics had come as close as it gets to Judaism, but had ultimately missed its encounter with Jewish thought by overlooking the ethical significance thereof. A number of essays were dedicated to Lyotard's scare quotes surrounding the word Jews. Why use square quotes? Lyotard announced on the opening page of his book that he was not talking of literal, real, or empirical Jews, but of some irreducible, some ur-affect, some metaphysical or meta-psychological principle that was at once at odds with the West and internal to the West, and of which the West always wanted to get rid, a sort of internal outside of Western civilization. We owe the most exhaustive study dedicated to Lyotard and the Jews to date to French philosopher Elisabeth de Fontenay, herself an admirer of Lyotard. To be sure, Lyotard was following in the footsteps of French philosemitism, from the famous Dreyfusard Charles Péguy in the late 19th and early 20th century, up to Maurice Blanchot, both authors on whom Jeffrey Melman, who is with us, has devoted groundbreaking studies, and to whom Sarah Hammerschlag dedicates illuminating pages in her book. The Jews, a principle of restlessness, the people of the book, the wandering people, the conscience of the West, with all the ambiguities that philosemitism carries within itself, and that the figure of Léon Bloy in the 1880s would exemplify better than any other writer. Bloy, who, to respond to the anti-Semite Edouard Drummond, argued that salvation comes from the Jews as long as the Jews remain in a state of abjection. Again, it is to Jeffrey Melman that we owe some illuminating pages to Bloy's philo-anti-Semitic response to Drummond and to its legacy in French modern thought. Long after Péguy in the 1969 essay, Maurice Blanchot held that being Jewish meant a condition of exile, nomadism, affliction, malheur, said Blanchot. It meant rejecting the gods of the locus and of landscape, the pagus, the paganus. It meant the rejection of any kind of existential or geographic mooring. It meant, finally, the unsettling of all moral and all ontological certainties. To those 19th century philo-Semitic motifs, exile, nomadism, conscience of the West, people of the book, taken up, I argue, by Blanchot in the post-war period, Lyotard in the 1980s had thus given a Freudo-Lacanian twist. The conscience of the West would be turned into its unconscious, its objet petit a, its unattainable cryptic other. Judaism as a mere abstract trope, as a figure? Perhaps, and yet. It would be short-sighted to see Lyotard's troping of the Jew as a mere Pauline resurgence, as an erasure or an overcoming of Jewish difference, as a mere rejection of the Jew in the flesh. For indeed, Lyotard did not wish to dissolve the Jew into some abstract, disembodied, disincarnate universalism. Thus, in an essay published not long after Heidegger and the Jews, and entitled The Hyphen, Le Trait d'Union, Lyotard scorned the Pauline call to emancipation, i.e., to dissolution of Jewish difference and Jewish particularism. Or if you prefer, Lyotard warned against the overcoming of the law and of the flesh by the faith and the spirit. While he somehow idealized the Jews, uprooted them, Lyotard never fell into the trap of an abstract, universalistic interpretation of Judaism. To resist assimilation, to stand as a principle of marginality and irreducible difference. For the 20-something-year-old that I was at the time, was it not truly exciting? No need to be a practicing Jew, no need to waste my time going to shul and read Torah and learn Hebrew and study the Talmud. Being Jewish was in itself a guarantee of undermining order, territory, borders, and so on. It was being genuinely, authentically, irreducibly other. It even endowed the Jew, i.e. myself, with some moral superiority. Being a marginal, being a resistant without having to do too much, wasn't it the dream of any young man aspiring to nonconformism and to a literary or intellectual persona? Furthermore, a dubious equation was drawn between Jewish identity and affliction, suffering, or even traumatic experience. Consider indeed Diony Mascolo and Marguerite Duras' response to their non-Jewish friend and Dachau survivor, the communist résistant Robert Antelme. Reminiscing about his hearing of Antelme's testimony in 1945, Diony Mascolo wrote in 1987, 40 years later, I quote, "We have forever become Judaized," end quote. To have become Judaized meant to have been touched by the fate of the victims of Nazism, all the victims of Nazism, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, which also suggested an equation between Jewishness and victimhood, and pointed to this idea that from suffering comes a form of moral superiority, or, if one wants to be more generous with Diony Mascolo and Marguerite Duras, a form of moral or ethical obligation that would even be contagious. No need to have been a concentration camp survivor to be endowed with such a moral aura. Alain Finkielkraut, in his landmark book, The Imaginary Jew, published in 1980, had without complacency mocked his own post-Holocaust Jewish moral narcissism, and especially such reduction of Jewish identity to a traumatic one. Georges Semprún, in his second novel published 1 year before the events of May 68, Georges Semprún, the Spanish Buchenwald survivor and anti-fascist militant, invented the character of Hans. Hans is a German Jewish character who joined the resistance in order not to die as a Jew, in order to refuse the fate of the Jews. But Hans is also a Jewish ego ideal, a sort of narcissistic projection of the resistant as Jew and of the Jew as the pure figure of resistance to socio-economic oppression. And I quote Semprún, 1967 novel, "We have invented Hans as an image of ourselves, the purest image, the closest to our dreams. He would have been German because we were internationalists. He would have been Jewish because we wanted to liquidate all oppression and because the Jew, even passive or resigned, was the intolerable image of the oppressed," end quote. But even more flattering to my literary ego of the time, even more resonant with the expectations of a young scholar of French literature than being a figure of oppression endowed with the moral high ground, was Suzanne Handelman's argument that deconstruction and French literary theory were altogether a midrashic practice, a rabbinic commentary of sort. Handelman, today a professor at Bar-Ilan University, but who had been trained at SUNY and had long taught at the University of Maryland, developed that odd idea in Slayers of Moses, The Emergence of Rabbinic Interpretation in Modern Literary Theory, a book published in 1983. Imagine that. You could read Derrida and Lacan and Roland Barthes. You could read Flaubert, Proust, Georges Perec, and basically fulfill the Jewish law and the mitzvot. Why then bother studying the law? Why bother wasting time with the book when we had the books, the library of all the Western classics at our disposal? Why keep kosher? It became possible indeed to be a Jew, to feel Jewish, merely by doing what I had always wanted to do, reading French literature, analyzing it, deconstructing it, pointing to the impossibility of reaching an ultimate meaning, relishing the infinite play of signifiers, the pleasure of the text, the jouissance of the letter, and not keeping kosher. That was a treat. Any scholar of Derrida and Barthes could grow a beard, reading, deconstructing, disseminating meaning, and splitting hair. That was so Jewish, that was even rabbinic, we were told. And if for Hegel, reading the morning newspaper was the realist's prayer, for my generation, reading Proust and even Horresco reference, the anti-Semitic writer Jean Genet, was the postmodern Jew's shaharit, the morning prayer. I am, of course, caricaturing that blissful age, an age when Jewish difference somehow coincided with Derridian différance. In an intriguing essay published last year, literary critic Éric Marty argues that that blissful age has come to an end, and that the engagement with Jewish identity, especially in French modernity or postmodernity, has shifted from a universalism rooted in an attachment to difference with Lacan, Barthes, Derrida, Lyotard, from a period when French literary philosemitism heeded to idiom and to singularities, to a neo-Pauline abstract universalism. Let me put it differently. From a problematic identification with the Jews as différence, as literary analysis and hair splitting, roughly the 1950s to the 1980s, we have returned to Pauline Jew splitting. The Jew, in order to be authentically Jewish, must give up once again his or her particularism. According to this new split or schism, the authentic Jew is the reformer, the revolutionary, from Paul to Spinoza to Marx to Trotsky to Isaac Deutscher, from hair splitting then to Jew splitting. To be sure, there is some overlap between the two sequences or periods, and in fact, the 1968 slogan, "We are all German Jews," which is on the flyer for this symposium, which has recently returned in Alain Badiou, but also in less-known thinkers such as Martin Crowley or François Nudelman, bears witness to this overlap, i.e., to the harnessing of Jewish identity to abstract universalism. And such practice of Jew splitting can be observed in recent works by historian Enzo Traverso, who in The End of Jewish Modernity, published last year, deems that the Jew who is faithful to his Judaism is the Jew of critique, the revolutionary Jew emblematized by Trotsky. It can also be observed in Judith Butler's Parting Ways, who splits the Jew between good Jew and bad Jew, universalist anti-state Jew on the one hand, and particularist Zionist Jew on the other. Butler recycles Deutscher's notion itself, I believe, a recycling of the Pauline overcoming of Judaism and of Paul's notion of Verus Israel, of the non-Jewish Jew. For Butler, like for Traverso, Badiou, Edouard Said in Freud and the non-European, the authentic Jew, the true Israel, is the Jew who has overcome Jewish particularism, a particularism that takes today the form of national Judaism, namely Zionism. We are all German Jews. This is, Sarah Hammerschlag reminds us, and I quote from Sarah's book, the famous slogan taken up by throngs of students during May 68 protests in Paris. The cry was most immediately the response of a crowd to the news that the movement's leader, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, had been denied re-entry into France after a brief trip abroad, end quote. Since Sarah has provided a powerful interpretation of the 68 slogan in her book, I will end this introduction on my own commentary, which is more critical and perhaps less generous than hers, a commentary which in one way or another will be either embraced or challenged today and tomorrow by our speakers. To do so, I want to turn to Badiou's book on Paul and Universalism, published in 1998. And I will argue that the May 68 slogan has its direct origin in Pauline supersession theology. For Badiou, the new community of Christians formulates itself through the axiom of synergy par excellence, the formula of the common work, synergeia, which is for him the very axiom of the universal, I quote Badiou, we are all. Badiou merely suppresses the name of God, since in Paul's Corinthians, one reads instead of we are all, I quote St. Paul, we are all the co-workers in God's service. Once omitted the name of God, one obtains the formula of the Communist Manifesto heralded by Paul for Badiou, workers of all countries unite. But if one agrees that the statement we are all originates in Corinthians, it becomes clear that the May 68 slogan, we are all German Jews, should read as there is neither Jew nor German, i.e., as the overcoming of the predicate Jew, and thus as a post or meta-Judaic statement, as a Neo-Pauline overcoming of Judaism. The slogan, "We are all German Jews," thus empties out the predicate Jew of its substance and turns the Jew into a non-Jewish Jew, a post-Jew, meta-Jew, neo-Jew. Jew becomes an empty name bereft of any empirical reference, and I should add, Jew becomes the paradigm of the erasure, at least for Badiou, or of the overcoming of all predicates. Once again, a Christian name or a communist predicate. So I have sketched a personal history of theories and engagement with the Jewish figure. I hope that this symposium will challenge or at least complicate that narrative. Thank you and welcome.